Today we are joined by Thomas Schwartz. Thomas is a professor and historian of American foreign relations and is the author of several books, including Henry Kissinger and American Power. Make sure to hit the like and subscribe button and comment your thoughts below. Enjoy the episode. I'd like to start off with a question that I want to start to begin every one of my podcasts with. This is a question that I grapple with almost every single day, and I think asking historians and experts and all kinds of people from various backgrounds this question, I think, will give me a fuller perspective on this answer. Now, you've been a historian, a professor for quite a long time. So, would it be fair to say that this stuff is pretty important to you?
Yeah, no, I do feel history is incredibly important. It provides it is actually, to quote my the subject of my recent book, but also the I think he was actually stealing this from someone else. History is the memory of states. It's really how it in a sense, if we think about human beings, and you think about one of the things we hate most about Alzheimer's, the loss of memory. States really, history is their memory. It is their way of keeping their values, ideals, and having a perspective on their current position, their identity, their people's identity, and the rest. So I think history is extraordinarily valuable.
Wow, that is so profound. That's something I've never thought of from that angle before. That's such a profound parallel, the idea of Alzheimer's.
Well, I thought about it in times because the United States is a country that frequently exhibits Alzheimer's because it does have a tendency to forget its history, and that's something that I think all of my profession sort of argues against. We need to keep our history in mind when we develop public policies, when we think about the direction in which we want to move.
100%. I think politicians especially need to be especially keen on history because when I think about it, even a lot of policy making decisions, there's historical precedent there. You can look back on history and see, it's different times, different contexts, but you can see and kind of plug in your current time and situation into past precedents and see what worked, what didn't, how did this play out. So I think even from a policy making perspective, not just a national identity and a patriotism and sort of a reverence for our ancestors and what they did before us, but even from a public policy perspective, I think history will do a lot of service in that.
Well, Jake, at the University of Florida, one of the things Will Inboden is trying to do, or in this new Florida, is to have a historian of applied history, the idea that you would actually apply history. And I actually know some of the candidates for that position who are really quite good in terms of the attempts to use history constructively when thinking about public policy. So this is a term, applied history, that's now come into vogue for the attempt to use history, or at least to keep history in mind when adopting public policy.
Yeah, that's a great idea. There was I'm sure you're familiar with David Rubenstein, but he did a series of lectures and talks to members of Congress at the Library of Congress with all sorts of big historians, and he wrote a book about it. I listened to the audiobook because he basically each chapter he had the interviews. So like Doris Kearns Goodwin's, Robert Caro, I remember one on Eisenhower, David McCullough on John Adams. So he was sort of playing along that idea of informing members of Congress, the ones who actually make policy on our history.
I think that's great, and in some ways, like you say, it's something that we'd like all politicians to do, but what they end up doing oftentimes is using history to score political points more than to really think about it deeply. But you have to accept that that's part of their almost job description.
Yeah, exactly. Especially it feels even more so in this age of politics. People are calling back to history all the time. But let's dive into sort of our topic for today, the foreign policy of the Vietnam era, the 70s with Nixon and Kissinger. I do want to start though with LBJ and how we got to the Nixon administration. LBJ is widely criticized for his handling of Vietnam, obviously, escalating the war. Obviously, we see public opinion turn violently against him in some cases. Um, what was the decision making process behind escalating the war originally? Where was Johnson's head at originally? Did he want the war? Did he want to escalate it? And then why did he end up escalating it?
Okay, well, here you're going to have to let me preface what I say by saying that this is a very contested issue among historians. Lyndon Johnson's motivations are a complicated mix of politics and foreign policy, and so anything I say here might be seen differently by other historians who studied Johnson. I come down. The book I wrote on Lyndon Johnson was very much influenced by one of his national security advisors, Francis Bator, and Francis became something of a mentor to me in studying and thinking about Lyndon Johnson. And Francis's argument, which I ended up feeling quite strongly captured it, was that Lyndon Johnson was faced with a dilemma in July of 1965. Essentially, the North Vietnamese had decided to escalate the war. They believed that in the aftermath of the overthrow of Ngo Dinh Diem, the chaos in South Vietnam, the political instability, had provided them with a perfect opportunity to seize power. And they escalated. They sent troops. They got additional supplies from their allies, Soviet Union and China. I think they were determined to win the war quickly. And Johnson, I think in 1965, believed that he had a window of opportunity to enact many of his sort of far reaching domestic programs, but that if he were to lose Vietnam, he would suffer the same fate Harry Truman had suffered back in 1949 of the who lost China debate. Basically, that the politics of foreign policy and the perception of weakness on the part of the president, in particular a Democratic president, would allow his opponents to stop his domestic initiatives. So I think for a combination of reasons, and I place domestic politics fairly high along with foreign policy and not wanting to lose a country to the communists in the Cold War. I think the combination of those two led Johnson to the decision to escalate the war in response to the basically to the escalation of the war that North Vietnam had undertaken. So that's it. That's disputed by many. Some see domestic motivations only. Others see foreign policy motivations only. I see a combination of the two.
I I I think that's a good point. Obviously, the Vietnam War is such a complicated, like you say, contested aspect of history. But especially when analyzing Johnson, such a complicated individual, um, his domestic agenda was the forefront of his political career. He had very lofty ambitions and goals in terms of his domestic policy. So I think excluding that when analyzing his motives would be folly. But do you think he really had a choice?
Um, I think he did have a choice. In the sense the problem was that, like you say, his domestic motivations were extraordinary. I mean, he wanted to transform American life, both in civil rights and social welfare, and effectively he could have chosen some path that effectively let South Vietnam fall to the communists in 1965, and somehow tried to spin it in some way or another. I think if he had been, if in some ways, again, this isn't perhaps being fair totally to him, but I think if he had maybe had some, if he had listened to George Ball, who was in his cabinet, who said, "Look, we're going to go down the same road as the French. This is not going to work." Come up with some other solution, but he didn't really. Most of his advisors really backed it. Some wanted to go much more full in militarily. I don't think it was determined. I don't think it was a determined thing that was the only choice. But I do think that the odds, if you look back on it, the odds were very much in favor of escalation, given the values and ideas that most people had in 1965.
Values and ideas. This is something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. I'm taking American foreign policy right now. I just read Kissinger's World Order, like I mentioned. And that's sort of the relationship between idealistic, moral responsibility driven foreign policy and pragmatic foreign policy, and sort of the balancing relationship between these two. And I think, when you analyze Teddy Roosevelt versus Wilsonian, I know they always get contrasted. Roosevelt to me seemed a little more pragmatic when it came to foreign policy, and Wilson was obviously very much an idealist. Um, so I mean, at this time in the Cold War, communists is running rampant throughout the 20th century. From my understanding, the prevailing American position was containment. Eisenhower had his domino theory that if one nation falls to communism, others would follow. Did this sort of drive the decision making, the idealistic approach to communism, or was this strictly sort of a political decision?
Yeah, again, I'm going to invoke my dear mentor, late mentor Francis Bator on this one. Francis understood that one of the things Johnson wanted was a sort of stability. So, for example, one of the things I argue in my book is that Johnson was more than willing to work with the communist regimes in Eastern Europe toward a sort of settlement and a sort of stabilizing of the European situation. So he wasn't a diehard anti communist. He basically accepted the idea that the Soviet Union and the United States were the two powers, that they had interests in both their regions of the world. The problem was in Asia, he was afraid that showing weakness in Vietnam would undermine everything else he was trying to do. That were South Vietnam to collapse, not only would it undermine his domestic achievements in the sense the Republicans would make a strong case against doing such domestic reforms in the midst of a defeat like Vietnam, but it would also undermine his attempts to come to a balance with the Russians because it would be seen as he's too weak and he's not standing up for America strong enough. And it would, in that sense, embolden hardline Cold War views at a time when there was actually a beginning of a thaw in the relationship with the Soviet Union in the 60s. So I'm not again this bit of a nuance, and not everyone accepts this about LBJ because he expressed himself often in very crude ways, and people see it very differently. But I do think there was more of a nuance in his understanding of the communist position in the world.
Yeah, for sure. Um, Cold War diplomacy is something so fascinating to me. It's such a power game in the Cold War. It's like a a schoolyard with a bunch of bullies, and they have to figure out how to posture and how to make the other guy basically submit. It's almost childish when you really boil it down, but it's also so complicated at the same time. It's really fascinating. Um, but nevertheless, public opinion turns on LBJ. Vietnam War is very unpopular by 1968, and Nixon's running on this peace through honor, peace with honor policy. He brings on Henry Kissinger to his team as his national security advisor. What exactly was their goal in Vietnam? Did their policies differ from Johnson in any way? What was basically their platform that they were trying to achieve?
I think what Richard Nixon was trying to achieve was what Dwight Eisenhower got in Korea. I think he was trying to achieve something of a stable situation that allowed South Vietnam to survive, but getting the Americans out and stopping the war. So I think he hoped for stabilizing and preserving an independent South Vietnam. If he didn't get that, if he couldn't get that, I think what he was looking for was a decent time span between the time the United States could negotiate something with the North Vietnamese and get out, and when the North Vietnamese eventually took South Vietnam, what's so-called decent interval idea. So I think in both cases, John Nixon had a fairly he wanted out of Vietnam in part because he had other grander goals in foreign policy. He wanted to deal with the Russians. He wanted an agreement on nuclear weapons. He wanted to ultimately, he wanted to use China, develop relations with China. So I think Vietnam in that sense was a nuisance in part, but he also realized how important it was to the American people. So he wanted at least something that he could salvage in Vietnam. And this is something that I think is hard for some people to accept because, of course, if you lost someone in Vietnam, you want it to be meaningful. But in the end, I think Nixon thought it had been a colossal waste, and so that we should have. He was trying to figure out a way to get out of it with some degree of respect for the United States.
Yeah, nuisance is a good word for it.
Probably trivializes it too much, though, Jake. I think what I'm getting at is that he did have these larger objectives. He wanted to play the great power game with the Russians and the Chinese, and Vietnam to him seemed a distraction from that.
Yeah, for sure. And also, he was handed such a difficult situation. Like you said, he wanted to salvage it, and he ran so hard on ending the war, peace through honor, that 2 episodes ago I had on Keith Saliba, and we talked about this very thing with the Vietnam War and Nixon's Vietnamization and sort of the conclusion of the Vietnam War. And his sort of argument was that the war was completely winnable, especially with the policies that Nixon and Kissinger were pursuing. But because the war was so unpopular and because Nixon was so determined to end the war, that they sort of rushed the ending, and they kind of had to make the best of a bad situation.
I think that's partially true. I'm not sure how winnable the war was. I think that, as I've mentioned to you, Pierre Asselin's book on Hanoi makes it very clear the determination of the North Vietnamese never to give up. And I think that determination on the part of the communist leadership of North Vietnam and their ability to get assistance from their allies as well as to mobilize their own people makes it very unlikely, I think, in the long run that South Vietnam was going to be able to survive. You would have had to have, like in Korea, you would have had to have the United States stay with 50,000 or 100,000 troops based there like it did in Korea. And I just don't think the American people were willing to accept that.
Yeah, that just would have been completely unacceptable to the American people. Did you mention, this is always very interesting to me as well, is the determination that underdog forces fight with um when it comes to their ideals. We see this originally in the American Revolution. The Americans are fighting with these ideals. They're fighting for independence, and they're fighting the greatest military force in the world. And I we see that parallel with North Vietnam. It's you never underestimate a an underdog or a ragtag fighting force. Never underestimate them when they're fighting for their homeland or for their ideals.
Well, yes and no on that. I think North Vietnam was also fighting a war of conquest, but it had important allies. It had the Russians and the Chinese helping it and providing it lots of weaponry. But I think the North Vietnamese soldier felt that he was fighting against foreign invaders. And so, in that sense, the communist leadership of North Vietnam was able to sell the war to its people. Although, we now know it was not an easy thing. I mean, they really did suffer enormously, and many of their people, I think, would have been more than happy with a peace settlement much earlier. But the leadership in Hanoi was absolutely determined to win that war.
Yeah, the leadership. Yes, this may be a difficult question to answer. Maybe if you haven't, which I haven't, read any memoirs or anything from Vietnamese like average soldiers. But how much do you think that the average Viet Cong soldier, North Vietnamese soldier, really believed in communism, or what was this, like you said, kind of a war of conquest?
Well, the classic book coming out of North Vietnam is Bao Nin's Sorrow of War, and that is a wonderful book to read. You read that book and you realize the motivations of the ordinary North Vietnamese or Viet Cong soldier was really geared nationalism. It was getting rid of the foreigners. It was getting rid of these Americans coming in just like the French. And in fact, what Bao Ninh in the Ken Burns documentary, he's still alive and he was interviewed in it, talked about was we weren't fighting for communism. We were fighting against the invaders, the nationals. And that one of the problems that came was after the Americans left was the fact that it was a Vietnamese civil war. And that it was much more of a war of Vietnamese against Vietnamese, which Bao Ninh said was much harder to be motivated to kill other Vietnamese in the war. But North Vietnam's leaders were absolutely determined, and the South Vietnamese leadership never really got it together. and we basically pulled the plug on their assistance in 1974. And I think ultimately they were unable to defeat a much more determined adversary.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. So sort of the motivating factor was nationalism. Do you think that maybe American decision makers misunderstood that and thought it was a war about communism?
Yes, yeah, no, I think to a certain extent they underestimated the national component of the Vietnamese cause, and this was something they recognized, but I think underestimated in the ability or the determination of the North Vietnamese to win their struggle.
I want to talk a little bit more about the controversial aspects of Nixon and Kissinger's policies. This is something we didn't really touch on in our last conversation about Kissinger was um, his more controversial aspects. Some of the things that many people uh, call him a war criminal for. Um, I think one of the biggest reasons for that sentiment was the decision to bomb Cambodia and Laos. Can you walk me through that decision making process?
Okay, well, we were bombing Laos long before that. Laos is not really central. That was something that it was went on all through the war. It was the bombing of neutral Cambodia yeah, that really triggered a lot of the resentment of Kissinger. And the reason that is so crucial is because the bombing upset Cambodian society in a manner that allowed the ruthless and genocidal Khmer Rouge to ultimately take power and then basically destroy Cambodian society and kill 2 million people, 2 million of its own people. And to the extent that our bombing of Cambodia contributed to that, that's the reason why many see Kissinger and Nixon's actions as criminal. I don't think that's altogether fair because, in many respects, the bombing of Cambodia was a bombing of North Vietnamese soldiers. And the North Vietnamese had occupied large sections of eastern Cambodia in order to launch attacks on South Vietnam. But it's still tragic, and what happened to Cambodia is still tragic. The manner in which Kissinger and Nixon went about it, trying to keep it secret from the American people, also, I think, encourages this sense that it was illicit. One of the reasons they were keeping it secret was because they knew there would be protests against it. And in that sense, when it was finally exposed, of course, there were protests, of course, against it. But I think in military terms, what Nixon and Kissinger were doing was not something that I think is out of bounds or in some sense illegal. They were bombing North Vietnamese troops who were killing American troops. So, in a sense, it's not. I don't find it as compelling an argument against Henry Kissinger as others do.
Was that one of the things that were exposed in the Pentagon Papers?
No, the Pentagon Papers were about the Johnson administration's policies and the Kennedy and Nixon. The Pentagon Papers, the intriguing thing about the Pentagon Papers is even though Nixon and Kissinger tried to stop their publication, the papers themselves said nothing about them. They were all about going back to Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, and that's the interesting thing is they were trying to stop it because there were sort of secret materials in those considerations. But it also, I mean, the main reason was that the Pentagon Papers were so explosive as an issue was because they seemed to indicate that American leaders deliberately deceived the American public about the war and the escalation of the war, and that was what they were concerned with.
And I think it also set off a chain reaction that would lead to Watergate.
Yes, it did.
I
Yep.
think you can make that case because then, Nixon was afraid of leaks. He appointed his plumbers. They broke into what was his name?
Daniel
Ellsberg.
Ellsberg's
Dan
psychiatrist's office.
Yeah, Daniel
Yep.
Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office and got the papers and then his plumbers and those sort of
They were trying to discredit Ellsberg as a source by showing that he had
yeah.
psychiatric problems. But this
Yeah,
was
yeah.
ultimately it was one of the more serious offenses compared to the others in Watergate.
Yeah, for sure. Which, sort of a blunder on their part. We saw how that played out. But I mean, going back to the Khmer Rouge, the rise of Pol Pot, do you think the bombing caused that? Because that's obviously such a contentious issue of debate, and whether the bombing of Cambodia caused that. But there's also, the counter argument, which in principle I tend to land on is, it sort of takes away the agency of those people, blaming American involvement. And while I do think that's, it's a necessary discussion to have, and it may have contributed, is I always, in principle, come down in favor of, the fact that people have agency, and, they make these decisions, and, things happen because of those decisions made.
I would largely agree with you. I just think that it is likely that the bombing of Cambodia did at least disrupt Cambodian society in a way that made the triumph of the Khmer Rouge at least possible. Again, I agree with you that the people have agency, and in many respects, uh, Cambodia was probably likely to be drawn into the war, and had South Vietnam fallen, I can't imagine that Cambodia would be able to stay neutral. But again, we don't know that. We don't know what path history might have taken had the administration chosen a different path.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, at the very least, it sort of created an environment for something like that to happen, but maybe not a direct causation. But this is where we go back to that sort of idealist versus pragmatic approach. Um, I have my answer. I think that Nixon and Kissinger were clearly pragmatists who wanted to achieve American interests, but were Nixon and Kissinger at all interested in sort of that idealistic approach of spreading American ideals, spreading democracy, that sort of thing, or were they really strictly, pragmatists who wanted to make?
No, I think, my own sense from listening to tapes, watching their policies and that, they really didn't have a lot of time for a more idealistic approach. They felt they were dealing to the way one could see them as idealists is that they really were principally anti-communist. They did fear communist power, and a world in which the Soviet Union or China had greater domination. They wanted to prevent communism from expanding. But outside of that, they were more than happy with authoritarian governments that prevented that. They had good relationships with groups, people like the Shah of Iran or other dictators, or even Pinochet in Chile. So they were not. I think they did. Kissinger just did not think human rights as an issue was something that diplomats should deal with. He was much more concerned with power issues, believing in effect that stability and American power would ensure a a better world. And one of the things Kissinger often said in his defense, which I think was a bit extreme, but I do understand where he's coming from, is avoiding nuclear war was the ultimate human rights issue. And to the extent that you minimized the risk of nuclear war through detente and the opening to China and the lessening of the international temperature and the possibility of nuclear war, you were doing a great thing for human rights. In that sense, he saw the nuclear issue as the central issue that he needed to address, and felt that his administration, Nixon's administration, had done something in that regard that was truly historic.
I I, I think that's fair. I mean, when you look at the possibility of nuclear war, and how that would play out, that would be the ultimate violation and destruction of any, human rights in general. So I mean, I do think preventing, especially in the Cold War, preventing that should be at the top of the priorities. But I mean, this is something Kissinger talks about in the book World Orders. He talks about the dangers of that moral and ideological rigidity in diplomacy. And do you think this also contributes to why him and Nixon are so criticized, because they may have abandoned some of those American ideals that are part of our identity, and that sort of shaped American foreign policy up until that?
Yeah, no, I think their occasional cynicism, which they expressed on the tape, sometimes much more directly, the sorts of things that they said, I think it does open itself up to the very much to the target of people who see foreign policy and want foreign policy to be about ideals, American identity, about spreading democracy, or at least encouraging it, trying to deal with human rights issues in countries by pressuring countries to be less repressive. So the sorts of things Kissinger and Nixon were not really interested in as much. And I think that has opened them up to sharp critiques that I think occasionally are um, I, are one-sided in the sense that you have to at least recognize that they had what were their alternatives, what would a policy, a better policy, have been. And I think sometimes that can be done in a fair way. Other times, I think it's a little bit of moral posturing.
Yeah. Yeah, sort of the virtue signaling. I think it's always important to approach history with empathy and context and nuance to understand the context of the time, the motives, that sort of thing. Um, do you think that the Nixon administration, particularly with him and Kissinger, and sort of their policies, do you think it kind of represented a turning point in American foreign policy? Like I said, up until that time, it was very idealistic. We want to spread democracy and American ideals abroad. They had that Americans had that sort of moral superiority that they felt that their institutions were better. But then when you look at the Nixon Kissinger administration, it's very pragmatic, very American interests. We got to achieve our objectives and sort of put that moral responsibility to the wayside. Did that represent a turning point in the history of American foreign policy going forward? Do you see a shift there?
No, I tend to see things more in terms of cycles rather than sort of one way and another, in the sense that if you look at the long stretch of American history, there were periods of time in which our foreign policy was ruthlessly pragmatic. The expansionists of the 19th century, things like that. And so, World War II had contributed, especially the defeat of the Nazis and fascists, had contributed to this idealism, and American power, the extraordinary American power, had given us really the ability to do things like reshape Germany and Japan in ways that people thought were extraordinary at the time. But by the time you get to Nixon and Kissinger, you are really dealing with an America that's not as overwhelmingly powerful as it was in 1945 or 1950. It's an America that's has rebuilt Europe and has adversaries that are also strong. The Soviet Union, by the time Nixon becomes president, had equaled the American nuclear arsenal and it wasn't an economic rival, but it was clearly a military rival. So I think, in a way, there's cycles in American history in which we go through periods of great idealism. And I think, for example, at the end of the Cold War, you had something of this in American foreign policy for a time. But now we're going back to great power competition, and I think we're in a period where we're going to see a lot more of the pragmatism emerge than idealism in the way which we deal with issues.
Yeah, that's interesting. Cycles, I think is a very good way to put it. Just to go off on a little bit of a tangent, this is something that always interests me. As a young person, I'm living through these times. I didn't get to live through the Cold War, but you did. Um, What would you say was sort of kind of American pop culture, sort of American sentiment? What did you see as a young person growing up through the Cold War? What was your view of the Soviet Union and communism in terms of like a cultural view?
Okay, well, again, you ask Americans here to get different stories here. There are certain commonalities. Um, I went to Catholic school, and Catholic school was very much anti-communist because of the persecution of Catholics by the communists. And it was and so the image that I had as growing up as a young person was very anti-communist. And the communists were the people who shot priests and nuns. They preached atheism, all of that. So the clarity of the Cold War was certainly there when I was growing up. What complicated it was, of course, the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, I was a young person then. The fact that the United States seemed to be on the wrong side at times in terms of things like the My Lai massacre or some of the things that went on there alienated a lot of us, and we began to think, well, maybe we were wrong about the communists or about the nature of the Cold War. And I think to a certain extent, I went through the complications and the rethinking of the Cold War that went on during the 70s and 80s. In the 70s, particularly, there was this sort of sense that maybe the Cold War is over and we should just deal with the communists as any other power. And then, of course, by the end of the 80s, you had the Afghanistan invasion, you had the Russians really throwing their weight around, and the election of Ronald Reagan, who sort of invoked the sort of old fashioned anti communism. And I remember being in Cambridge then, I was doing my PhD, and everybody was anti Reagan because they thought he was, bringing back this terrible anti communism. But ultimately, by 1988 and 89, Reagan had negotiated these agreements. The Soviet Union was beginning to change, and it looked like maybe they were right. Communism was, and then the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe made, I think, a big impression on me in the sense of seeming to vindicate what had happened in the Cold War. That the Cold War really was about good versus evil. These regimes were not accepted by their people, and they collapsed quickly when that happened. And so I went through different experiences during the Cold War. I do think American popular culture also did, in the sense that when I was growing up, everything was anti Soviet, anti Chinese. Then Vietnam complicated that picture a great deal. The movies, the Vietnam movies of the time, all of that. And then it got back, you had in the Reagan years a sort of return to that. And all of that, I think, is a feature of American culture in general, the ability to sort of go back and forth.
Yeah, I love the manifestation of that in movies. I'm a huge movie nerd. I love movies, and watching the movies of the 80s and seeing sort of the cultural manifestation of that in pop culture. My favorite is Rocky 4. Uh that's the classic Cold War movie, the best Rocky movie in my opinion. He goes over there and fights the Russian. What's your favorite sort of Cold War movie?
My favorite Cold War movie would probably surprise you. It's The Manchurian Candidate. If you, not the remake, the original Manchurian Candidate is one of my absolute favorites because it really gets at how fearful people were of what the Cold War was doing to our own country. At the same time, the picture of the Russians and the Chinese as these evil manipulators is certainly there too. It's I show it to my students still because of course it evokes McCarthyism, it evokes the Cold War paranoia. There's a whole spying element too, and Frank Sinatra is wonderful in the movie. He's great, and Janet Leigh, and it's a great movie. It also has there's a certain very much a product of its time. It came out the same week as the current Cuban Missile Crisis, and so it was sort of the Cold War at its peak in a certain way.
Yeah, the communist brainwashing and the red scare
Brainwashing,
and all of
yes,
that. Yeah.
very much.
That's funny. But going back to Reagan, this is interesting and something that I've been thinking about recently because I do think for the most part Nixon's foreign policy was pretty masterful in terms of kind of the global political chess that he played. But from my you know perspective, I think Nixon was a little bit more conciliatory. Détente with the Soviet Union, the opening of China, and he eased those Cold War tensions, but he didn't end it. And then when you look at Reagan, he was very confrontational towards communism and the Soviet Union. This is an evil empire. This is good versus evil. We win, they lose. It's sort of very different rhetoric, and it was Reagan who ended the Cold War. So, I mean, do you think that more confrontational policy was the better option?
Well, again, look at the Reagan years are an interesting mix because he certainly begins very confrontationally, but that's also when he's building up military forces so to be able to negotiate from a position of strength, because he turns rather conciliatory in his second term, and especially because he gets in Mikhail Gorbachev, he gets a partner, he gets someone that he can really deal with, and Gorbachev's aims. And this is, of course, one of the complicated historical arguments that goes on. Who should get more responsibility for ending the Cold War, Ronald Reagan or Mikhail Gorbachev? Because Gorbachev's reforms of the Soviet Union, the types of things he initiated ultimately also did lead to the changes that took place, as well as I think, again, you get a combination of both Reagan's policies and Gorbachev's policies in helping to produce the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, that's interesting. It was maybe sort of a perfect storm, but I mean, speaking to that attitude shift in Reagan, I read a book by Annie Jacobson about nuclear war, and she basically breaks down kind of second by second what a realistic modern day nuclear war scenario would look like. But I was listening to her on a podcast, and she was talking about Reagan, and there was this documentary or movie that was released around that time. I forget which news outlet
You're
released
talking
it.
about the ABC television movie The Day After.
Yes, exactly. The day after. Yes, ABC. And she claims that right when that came out and it showed the disastrous effects of nuclear war, Reagan saw that, and then that's what marked his attitude shift. Was he realized that he was very strong on defense spending and a strong military, but after he saw that, he became sort of hesitant about strong military confrontation and nuclear war.
I think that's probably oversimplifying it. It certainly the film certainly had an impact on him. If you've seen the film, I've seen it a couple of times. I actually have shown it to my students. I mean, it is a very terrifying scenario of nuclear war and what nuclear war would have meant. And I think Reagan was moved by it, and did work then to try and de-escalate the rhetoric. I mean, Reagan found himself. There's some wonderful points in his diary where he says he can't. He really was surprised to hear the Soviets really believe that he might strike them first nuclear. He had never thought that they could actually believe that the U.S. would engage in such behavior. So he did try. I think he did try in his own way to reassure the Soviets that he wasn't looking to start a nuclear war. And as you probably know, I mean, he was committed in his own mind to abolishing nuclear weapons. And he came very close to doing that with Gorbachev. He thought nuclear weapons should be abolished. And one of the reasons he promoted his Strategic Defense Initiative, which was called Star Wars by its critics, was the idea that if the United States could develop a defensive shield, it would render nuclear weapons pointless.
Yeah, that's it, and that's when he walked out on the negotiations with Gorbachev, I think.
Yeah, in 1986 with
Yeah,
Reykjavik,
yeah.
yes.
Huh.
Yeah.
Let's go to Nixon's visit to China. This is so fascinating on so many levels to me. Um, I think it was a masterful play. Really changed the Cold War. But what was the initial motive there? What was the initial sort of motive in visiting China? Why did Nixon see this necessary? Because I think it was China who reached out first and wanted to initiate it, right?
That's questionable. I think Nixon was the one who initiated this, or at least tried to signal the Chinese that he was interested. And the Chinese, the absence, we had no real way of communicating with the Chinese at that time. And we had to use third parties, particularly Pakistan, which was problematic in its own way. But we used other countries to send the message that he was interested. You have to remember that one of the key points that happened very early in Nixon's administration was the Chinese and the Soviets actually fighting, literally fighting, in the northeastern part. They conducted a serious battle, military battle over territory in northeastern China that China claimed and that the Russians held. And it was a bloody, bloody battle. And then that it also broke out northwest, so that China and the Soviet Union were coming close to war. And Nixon and Kissinger ultimately came to realize that was a real opening for the United States. The fact that the the two great superpowers, the Sino-Soviet bloc, were fighting each other, and that was the trigger to Nixon, was the sense that this gives us a real opportunity to exploit this division.
Yeah, that I think is what makes it such a great play is it played the two giant communist superpowers of the world against each other because I think people may not realize when looking back on the Cold War, um, from sort of a casual understanding is you think the U.S. and the free world versus democracy or versus communism, but even the communist bloc of the world were very divided. And Nixon just drove that wedge in there and really exploited that. And I think that also sort of contributed to eventually the end of the Cold War and the weakening of the Soviet Union.
Absolutely, because in a way, China became something of almost a tacit ally of the United States in isolating the Soviet Union. And that was something that really did contribute to the end of the Cold War. China, helped us, for example, send supplies to Afghanistan to the Mujahideen against the Soviet invasion there. So, yes, I mean, the divisions in the communist world played a big role.
I was also reading Dwight Chapin's memoir. He was sort of one of Nixon's personal aides, and he was talking about another aspect of this where I was thinking, I just read that, and I was like, wow, that's Nixon must have been Nixon was so brilliant, and this may be true, whatever. But he was saying that Nixon kind of foresaw that the US and China would be adversaries in 50 years. And he said, if that's the case, we should at least be able to talk to each other and communicate with each other. And that was another one of the reasons for opening up China.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think Nixon had at least the realization that China represented such a large chunk of humanity that there was no way the United States needed to have some methods and ways of communicating to China. But I think he and Kissinger have this conversation before he goes off to China, where Kissinger tells him, someday you may have to line up with the Soviet Union against China, but right now we can use China against them. And so they were aware that they thought in terms of a triangular game that they might continue to employ, and in a way that was one of their ways of thinking.
That's so fascinating. Was Nixon criticized for the visit? Because I would assume, especially from the right and those hardline anti-communists, he would have been really criticized. And this is another thing that makes it so masterful is, people talk about this. Nixon was the only guy who could have pulled this off because of his record of anti-communism from his time in the Congress and Senate as VP. That people knew he was anti-communist. So him doing this, they realized that he was the only person who could pull this off. But was he criticized at the time?
Yes, yes, he was criticized, particularly, the sort of right wing conservatives, you might say, identified with William Buckley, the National Review, others who were very strongly committed to Taiwan or the nationalist Chinese and felt that this was a betrayal of them. So there was criticism, but it was very muted. I mean, the overwhelming response to Nixon's mission to China was positive. The polls showed that clearly. There wasn't on the right a very strong anti-Chinese effort in many respects. I mean, Nixon even brought along some of his critics on the trip. So he was and I think they, of course, one of the things that they respected about it, even if they disagreed with him, was the fact that he was doing it, not some liberal Democrat who would sell us down the river with China. They figured that, as you said, Nixon was the one person who could do it without really creating the sort of firestorm from a betrayal of Taiwan and the sense that we were reversing decades of policy. Remember that the Chinese during this time, one of the things that had happened as a result of the Korean War is that the Chinese had been seen as a much fiercer adversary to the United States. And the original commitment to Vietnam was in part expressed by Johnson as preventing Chinese expansion. So there was an anti-Chinese element in the United States that had to be pacified.
When I talk to some of my conservative colleagues, they're often critical that Nixon sold out Taiwan. Can you speak to that? Because I'm sure there were negotiations involved, um, in terms of what they were trying to accomplish. They were obviously negotiating something, and Taiwan is a very touchy subject with China. Obviously, I there was a lot of memes that came out recently with DeepSeek, which is China's new AI software, and people would go on and say, repeat after me to this Chinese AI, and they would say, the sun is hot, the grass is green, and then they would say Taiwan is a country, and it would keep repeating, and then when you say Taiwan is a country, they say Taiwan is part of China. It's interesting. So, what was sort of Taiwan's role as a bargaining chip in this? Did Nixon are those criticisms valid in that he sort of sold out Taiwan?
Well, I think this is, I don't really think they're valid in the sense that what Nixon and Kissinger did do was convince the Chinese, at least at the time, and particularly Mao and the leadership then, that there could be reconciliation with the West, but that they should wait about Taiwan, that they should postpone reunification. The United States ultimately agreed with China that there was only one China and that Taiwan was part of China, which was something Taiwan at the time agreed with. Taiwan believed it was the legitimate government of China. So, in a way, the United States played that. But what you have to remember is Taiwan at the time was a military dictatorship. It was not a democracy. And in many respects, had China pushed the issue at the time, there was not the same sort of defense of Taiwan that I think would come later, in particular as Taiwan evolved into what is a really prosperous and democratic state. It was a dictatorship under the rule of Chiang Kai-shek, the one who had lost the civil war with Mao. And so I think what they did do in the agreement, the Shanghai Communique, was in effect say we agree with China that there's only one China, but they also then encouraged the idea that any reunification would be a peaceful one. So I'm not sure that the accusation that they sold them out is fully justified, but they certainly. I don't think there was the same commitment to Taiwan with Nixon and Kissinger that would later come as Taiwan became more democratic and much more of a country that the United States could justify supporting both morally and geopolitically.
And also, I mean, because Taiwan was such a touchy subject with the communist China, if they wanted to achieve any sort of agreement or settlement or whatever, they had to compromise on Taiwan. Because if they would have came in, with the hard line, Taiwan's a country, you have to recognize their independence, they never would have came to an agreement.
Well, that was the one thing they were very they really emphasized to Nixon and Kissinger that they feared Taiwan declaring its independence. At the time, Taiwan was not like that. Taiwan basically was uh, had the government of the nationalist Chinese who believed them to be who believed that they should be the legitimate government of all China. But what they did worry about was a move toward Taiwanese independence, and they stressed that to Nixon and Kissinger.
Do you think then that, because you mentioned um, they sort of kicked the can down the road with Taiwan, thinking, hoping for later unification, and as we see today, that hasn't happened. So, do you think that was sort of a mistake at the time to have that approach because it hasn't come to fruition?
In many respects, pushing things down the road at least gives you the possibility of seeing things differently as they develop. And I think there was for a time in the say 90s, maybe before Tiananmen Square, there was the sense maybe China will evolve into a more democratic state so that a reunification would not involve the harsh elements of communism. It was the same thing that happened with the British in Hong Kong, turning over Hong Kong and hoping that the Chinese would respect Hong Kong's independence. And ultimately, the communists don't really respect independence, and that's not something. In that sense, you put your hopes in the idea that there will be an evolution that will make a solution more possible. And I don't. That's not an uncommon diplomatic technique. Is if you delay a solution, that you might get a better set of outcomes down the line.
Yeah, it at least gives the opportunity and leaves the door open for future negotiations. Um, reading Dwight Chapin's memoir, because he was there. He went to China. This is something that also fascinates me greatly. What was Kissinger and Nixon's sort of view of Mao? Because Mao, when you look at the 20th century dictators and the communist regime, people look at Hitler and Stalin and they killed all these people, but Mao killed more people than both of them. Um, so there, this is, I mean, I can't like, I try to put myself in Nixon's shoes. I'm an American. Have this anti-communist record, and now I'm going over across the ocean to visit China with the most brutal communist dictator in history. I mean, what is that like? In the tapes and the memoirs, how did Nixon and Kissinger talk about Mao?
Well, it's a fascinating point because they don't dwell on his crimes or his behavior in that sense. They really don't. But I think what you have to remember is I think that was not the foremost thing for most Americans. The foremost for most Americans was peace, and the idea that if we can have peace with China, that's a good thing. And in the immediate years before they met Mao, you have to remember the Cultural Revolution had gone on. So you saw millions of Chinese waving little Mao books, and Mao seemed the great hero to them. You know, so I think in a way they were more than happy to deal with him because, of course, Mao now was turning against the Russians, and he was willing to be this figure against the Soviet Union in a sense, a sort of tacit ally of the West, and so. in a sense, they were willing to overlook the fact that they were making a deal with the devil, and that was, and in a sense, I don't think they really thought, and really, you have to look hard for any mention of human rights or any of these issues with regard to China, even among opponents. I mean, the Democrats and liberals really wanted the opening to China, and there was an element of sort of the left in the United States that kind of idealized China. A lot of weird college students waved little Mao books in the United States, thinking that China had really perfected revolution and all the rest. It wasn't. The attitudes of the time were not focused, you might say, on the abuses, except on the right wing. I mean, William Buckley was not deceived, and sort of the conservatives, considered Mao this awful figure, but they were more marginalized at the time, and certainly in the larger debate. And so it's a different situation.
Yeah, it's interesting. It goes back to that, that tension between moral supremacy and, you know, realism. Um, but speaking of the Soviet Union, what was their reaction to this? Because they must have been pissed.
They were, they were. I mean, this really did. And I think this is one thing that I think historians do have to recognize, because they can be as critical as they want of Nixon, but this did really agitate the Soviets. This really got them very worried. The idea that the United States might join with the Chinese against them. And Leonid Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union, frequently lectured Nixon about the evils of the Chinese, and that that the Americans were being very dangerous in working with the Chinese. So this was clearly something that had a great impact on the Soviets. They were fighting, as I said, they were fighting. They had fought battles with the Chinese. Early in the administration, they had actually approached the Americans to ask what our policy would be if they decapitated the nuclear program, bombed the nuclear program, and destroyed China's capacity to build nuclear weapons. And Nixon basically said, we won't support an attack on China. So I mean, they were things were pretty bad during this time between China and the Soviet Union, and that made the Soviets very paranoid about China.
Wow. Huh. That's so interesting. Also another little thing that was happening at this time was the Vietnam War was still going on. This was 72, early 72, the China visit. Vietnam War still raging. How did that impact, Vietnam? Was there any sort of motive there to get better leverage or better bargaining chip in the negotiations with Vietnam?
Absolutely, no. The Nixon and Kissinger hoped that their outreach to the Soviets and Chinese would give them leverage against North Vietnam and get a peace agreement. The North Vietnamese were really angry about China allowing Nixon to come. I mean, this would ultimately lead, as you may know, in 1979, China and Vietnam would actually fight a war for a period of time. I mean, it led to that alienation with China that would continue and grow over time after the war ended. But yes, the North Vietnamese were very angry about the degree to which the Soviets and Chinese were cozying up to Nixon. And shortly after Nixon's visit to China, they launched their spring offensive, their Easter offensive, trying to overturn the South Vietnamese government. So they continued in this manner. That was their goal, was reunifying Vietnam, and they thought their allies were on the same page, whereas their allies really had other objectives too.
It's funny. It's funny. I wonder what Karl Marx would think of all of this because his vision of communism is this utopian, global, communal system of living where everyone's united under communism. But then you look at it in practice, and even the communist nations are all at war and divided amongst each other.
Absolutely no. I mean, Marx grievously underestimated the power of nationalism, and I think in many respects really did not understand how that worked in international politics. So
No, yeah, yeah, that's so interesting. But let's see here. So Nixon and Kissinger, they end up leaving South Vietnam. They go with detente with the Soviet Union. They open up China. This sort of seems like abandonment of the containment policy that had shaped the Cold War up until this point. Would you say that's true?
Not exactly. I think it was a modification of containment in the sense that the United States now had clear relationships with the communist powers, but Nixon and Kissinger still tried to prevent communist successes in other parts of the world. They tried to overthrow the government of Chile, which they thought was moving toward communism. They wanted to intervene in Angola against the communist movement there. They continued to have a strong sense of trying to stop other countries, particularly in what we now call the global south, but then called the third world. They were very much active in trying to keep communism from expanding still. Even though they ultimately abandoned Vietnam, they still wanted, I think, to prevent the expansion of communism elsewhere.
I wonder, because Watergate happens obviously and completely upends the Nixon administration, everything they were trying to accomplish. But let's see. So he resigns in, what was
August
it,
of
74?
74.
74? Yeah, yeah. So his term would have been until 76. He would have had, time to achieve his objectives and not have to worry about Watergate, which completely consumed his administration. So if Watergate didn't happen, do you think Nixon could have ended the Cold War, or do you think it at least would have ended sooner?
Not really. I think the dynamic of competition between the United States and the Soviet Union were there ultimately, and I think Nixon might have had there might have been a more of a regulation of the Cold War, and perhaps you would have avoided some of the crises that would come later. But I don't think he could have ended it then. I think because I do think one of the central things that ended the Cold War was the transformation of the Soviet Union, which I think took time and that was, as I say, an initiative that came when you had a change in the generational leadership and you had someone like Gorbachev come to power. I think Nixon, if Nixon had lived, I do think it's at least open to question whether South Vietnam would have fallen.
To sort of stray away and get into the realm of more philosophical questions, um, balance of power. There's sort of two approaches, it seems, when it comes to foreign policy. We kind of talked about the idealistic versus the realist, but there's also kind of the approach of whether the US is a participant in this international balance of power or whether the US is sort of a benevolent protector of that balance and sort of from a superior perspective, kind of the policeman of the world. Do you Where do you think Nixon and Kissinger's policy fits into that?
Oh, I think they preferred very much the balancing to being a policeman. I think they saw themselves as reacting against the promise of trying to intervene to police conflicts and prevent problems in the world, and that I think they hope to restore the notion of balance. That was central to Kissinger's thinking, that the United States should use its power carefully, but not engage in interventions and others that drained it away, as had in Vietnam. In that sense, they were very much they had been affected by the Vietnam War and recognizing the limits of American power and that American power had to be more carefully used. So I think they would have preferred and certainly thought in terms of creating balances of power.
I mean, Kissinger was kind of the one who coined the term balance of power, right?
Well, no, I think it probably predated him, but it's so identified with him in American history that it's like a lot of his expressions. I've discovered even the famous one about academic politics is so bitter because the stakes are so small. These are things that were said before him, but he is identified with a lot of expressions and other things that were not necessarily original to him, but because he's famous and it fits him.
That's also something interesting that we didn't talk about is Kissinger was really the first sort of celebrity secretary of state.
State, absolutely, yeah.
I mean, he
He
he he
was.
comes on the scene. There's pictures of him with the ladies. What was the famous actress he was with?
Well, there were a whole set of them, but Jill St. John is the one that comes to mind. And
Yeah,
Marlo
yeah, yeah.
Thomas was another, and I forget the other one, the Norwegian actress also that he squired around. I mean, yeah,
It's so funny this. this German-born diplomat with this heavy accent is now this American icon.
Well, it was for a time. He was the most admired man in America 3 years in a row in the 70s, and then he sort of fell out of favor. But he was at the height of his popularity. He had an approval rating in 85 to 90%.
Did you ever get to speak to him when you were writing your book? Really? Okay, we gotta flesh this out. So did you only meet him once, or you got to?
I only met him once directly. It was a courtesy interview, I think, because he was working. He knew one of my academic mentors, and he gave me an opportunity to come by and talk to him, and we did. And then I met him at. He came to the State Department when I was serving on the Historical Advisory Committee, and I got the opportunity to ask him a question then and interact with him a couple of times with the exchange of documents and the rest. But it was a minimal amount, but I did have at least the chance to meet him.
So what was your biggest takeaway from meeting him in person?
He's a very, very brilliant man. I mean, he was very, very smart and also very cagey. There was no, I should preface this by saying that I had done a previous book on an older diplomat, John McCloy, and McCloy was past the point where he really could engage. He was at that stage in his 80s where he was simply repeating stories, and you had a hard time really engaging him. Henry Kissinger never got to that point. Henry Kissinger was his brain never sort of showed that aging that you see in other people. He really his body may have faltered, but he remained incredibly quick and understanding of issues. So much so that, as you probably know, toward the end of his life, he was dwelling on the issue of artificial intelligence and its impact on international relations. I mean, that's an amazing thing when you think someone at that age is still that interested in modern developments.
That was what was at the forefront of my mind the entire time reading his book World Order. I mean, he basically sums up the history of geopolitics of every region of the world and all the complicated, nuanced interplays between nations, the United States' role in all of it. And I'm sitting there reading this and I'm like, I can only hope to become as smart as this, a fraction of as smart as this one day. I mean, just the amount of knowledge and understanding of diplomacy and foreign relations that he has. I could pick out at random a single sentence from that book, and it is just the most profound sentence that you could talk about for hours and flesh out. And every single sentence, it's like almost 400-page book. Every sentence is just the most brilliant, written, deep, nuanced thing. I'm like, this guy he's brilliant, and I can only hope to become a fraction of as smart as this.
Well, I think you are part of a fan club of his that does exist. There are people though, and I can tell you that really would reject all of that. Just say he was awful and everything else. So I recognize, and I probably am much closer to your view in terms of understanding him and seeing him as a really force for understanding American diplomacy and international politics. But he remains, as you pointed out at the beginning, controversial figure.
Yeah, I try not to be too naive because I'm such a nerd and fan about history. I have such a deep appreciation for the people who came before me that it's hard not to put them on a pedestal. So I often have to remind myself that these are people, and they're very nuanced lives. They have failures and successes, and it's important to study that because no one's perfect. It's something that I have to remind myself of often.
It is actually, I do think one of the occupational hazards of being a historian is that we do tend sometimes to glorify the past and think people that were smarter, wiser, whatever than our current people, and that is something that you have to fight against and remember that they were human and they had their own faults as well.
So what did you when you met Kissinger, what are some of the things that you asked him?
Well, I began the interview probably in the wrong way, and then I started talking about his early life, and I don't think he wanted to talk about that. It's not a topic. He did share more of that with his biographer, Neil Ferguson, but I don't think he wanted to talk about those issues, and I had been doing research on that. So he was not very happy with some of those questions. It was easier when we got into the geopolitical questions, but mostly he told me things that I'd already read in his memoirs. I didn't get any surprise revelations or anything like that. The funny part of the interview was when we got to the question of soccer. It was shortly before the World Cup, and so we were talking about a little bit about soccer. I had become interested in soccer from my children, and so we ended up talking about soccer. And he loved talking about soccer. That's one of his unknown contributions, is the degree to which he was involved in bringing soccer to the United States.
I can't. I would have been so starstruck.
Well, I was nervous. I will tell you that. Wouldn't say, but after a little while, you get past that. But he was, he was. It certainly was nervous before meeting him.
Wow. I mean, he's such a larger than life figure. It's crazy. And I did he ever, like, oh, good, like you ask questions like, oh, that's a great question.
No,
'Cause
that was not his style.
yeah,
No.
yeah. To me, that when someone says that, that's like the most rewarding thing to me because
I know. He was not going to do that, though. Although he did toward the end of the interview. I think, especially when we actually talked about soccer, he did sort of warm up a little bit and was less confrontational. He did not particularly care for one of my academic advisors, who he thought had been critical of him. And I did have the chance recently, Jake, to meet his son, David, who looks like him except has a beard. And it was very interesting to meet him and to hear that he had read my book and sort of thought it was. He didn't like some of the criticisms. He's a big fan of his father, needless to say, but he thought it was at least fair compared to some of the more nasty
that's got to be a
books about his
difficult
father.
life to be the
To
son
be
of
the
Henry
son of Henry
Kissinger.
Kissinger,
Yeah.
yeah. But I think David Kissinger did very well. He told some very interesting anecdotes about being Kissinger's son, and it was absolutely fascinating to meet him.
Yeah, but I mean, to live in any larger than life figure's shadow like that, but also someone as controversial as Henry Kissinger, I'm sure he gets plenty of hate mail and threats and disrespect because I mean, the Lincoln family, I was talking with a historian about Mary Lincoln and Robert Todd Lincoln, who's his son, and we were talking about the Lincoln family and his descendants and everything. And Lincoln's grandkids, I believe it was his grandkids or his great grandkids. Anyway, but there was three or four of them, and none of them had kids because they all hated being Lincoln's grandchildren. They absolutely despised it, and they made it an absolute point to never have kids, because they didn't want them to go through the same. I think some of them even infertilized themselves to make sure that they never had kids. So I mean, living through something like that where you're living in the shadow of a great man, I think it can make or break you.
Yeah, well, I don't think I think in the case of David Kissinger, he's very well adjusted. He went in a different direction than his father. He was a producer, a television producer, went to Hollywood, all of these things, and he had children. So I um, I think it's yeah, no, and I think Henry Kissinger in many respects was a very good father. So
That's awesome. I'm glad he made it through his childhood okay. Um Sort of a fun question for you, one that I love to ask uh history minded folks. If you could sit down and have dinner with any three figures from history, who would you pick? This is a very difficult question, I know, especially someone as well read as yourself.
well, I'm actually on record on this, Jake. Yeah, I don't know if you know of the organization, the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. It's the professional organization for people like me who are historians of foreign relations. It's a fairly large group. I think we have more than 1,000 members. We have conferences every year, but we have a newsletter. And I was interviewed for the newsletter once, and that exact question was asked. So here were the three, that I wanted to meet or would have found interesting. And I realized this is an unusual combination. The first was the Apostle Paul. I would have liked to meet him because he was so central in the propagation of Christianity, and I'm a Christian, and I would have loved to meet him. He was a dynamic figure, an extraordinary. The second was Vince Lombardi, who I had enormous admiration for as a coach of the Green Bay Packers and grew up sort of admiring his style and character. And the third was Robert Kennedy, who was my first political crush, so to speak. I worked in his campaign in 1968 as an 11-year-old or 12-year-old, and admired him greatly, and thought he was, sort of an amazing figure, and would have loved to have met him. So that's an unusual combination, as I said.
That is an interesting lineup. Would you like to see them interact together, or would you rather talk to them
I don't
separately?
know how they would have interacted together, but having said, although Vince Lombardi and Robert Kennedy were actually very friendly, I'm not sure how the Apostle Paul would fit in with that. But Lombardi and Kennedy knew each other.
Yeah, Paul and Coach Lombardi interacting would have been pretty comical. Yeah, that is interesting. I have two locks that I think are pretty indisputable indis, indisputable for me, and that's because I'm Catholic, so I'd have to pick Jesus as the central, role in basically human history. And then my second lock would be Leonardo da Vinci, who I think has the most fascinating mind in arguably human history. Just his hyper curiosity of the world is uh is astounding. I mean, the way he thought about things.
Yes, and Walter Isaacson has written a great biography of him.
That's
So
what sparked my interest was that I read his biography and I was like, I mean, this guy wrote down in his journal on his to-do list, describe the tongue of a woodpecker on his daily to-do list. I mean, who thinks like that? It's insane. And then my third, it really oscillates. It's such a difficult one. If I'm in a funner, more fun mood, then I tend to pick Elvis. I'm a huge Elvis fan. Hanging out with Elvis would be fun. But then if I'm a little bit more historically minded, I think one that right now would be really cool is Winston Churchill. I mean, he was talking to him would be quite the experience.
well, you probably have the image of Nixon meeting with Elvis.
I do. I am very familiar with that. I think if I were to pick one aspect of history, one little snippet of history that I would consider myself uh, the most of an expert in, it would be Nixon and Elvis's meeting at the White House.
It's a fascinating moment. So
It is. It's the most requested image in art in the
it's
National
just
Archives history. It's
absolutely. I
amazing.
have I have the coffee cup.
Really?
So
Yeah,
yeah,
I made a little video about it on my YouTube channel a while back. It was fun. But Tom, thank you so much for joining me today, taking the time to entertain my questions about American foreign policy.
I appreciated the opportunity, and let me know if when you end up posting it or something. I'll torture my daughters with it. So
All right, thank you. Where can people find your work?
Amazon. I mean, you Google Thomas Schwartz, you'll get. I think that the ones that are, I think a couple are still in print. The Kissinger one, of course, is going in paperback in a couple weeks, which is the first time I've gotten a book into paperback, which I'm really happy about.
Awesome. Well, I'll have that link down in the description below. But again, Tom, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. And Jake, thank you again.